Alpha King chose another mate, but her scent haunted him every night.
Blood dripped from the shattered silver goblet in King Valerius's hand, but the Alpha felt no pain. Across the grand firelit hall, the newly crowned Queen Vivienne celebrated her ascension, oblivious to the monstrous, hollow hunger tearing at her husband's soul. Valerius closed his eyes, inhaling sharply. Beneath the cloying scent of roasted meats, spilled wine, and expensive foreign perfumes, a phantom fragrance lingered, wild jasmine crushed under a heavy, impending autumn rain. It was her, the true mate he had publicly humiliated and cast aside for a political crown. Now, the throne felt like a suffocating tomb, and the scent of the woman he had discarded was slowly driving the Alpha King to sheer violent madness. The great mating ball at the Citadel of Highreach was supposed to be the dawn of a new era for the Silverhorn Kingdom. The year was 1244 of the moon cycle, a time when the threat of the northern rogues loomed heavy over the mountainous borders. King Valerius of House Whitmore, a towering, battle-hardened alpha with eyes the color of forged steel, stood atop the obsidian grand staircase, surveying the nobility of his realm. Tradition dictated that the moon goddess would guide the Alpha King to his destined mate on his 25th winter. But Valerius was a king first and a wolf second. His kingdom was bankrupt, its armies depleted from decades of border skirmishes. He needed the wealth and the legendary cavalry of House Montague. He needed Lady Vivienne, the sharp-eyed, fiercely ambitious daughter of the Southern Duke. The agreement had been signed in secret weeks prior. The ball was merely pageantry, a formality to appease the old lords who still believed in the sacredness of the fated mate bond. As the heavy oak doors swung open to admit the lesser nobility from the outer provinces, a sudden, violent shudder racked Valerius's massive frame. His inner wolf, dormant and disciplined for years, suddenly slammed against the cages of his mind. A low, guttural growl vibrated in Valerius's chest, drawing a concerned glance from his trusted captain of the guard, Gideon. Then, the scent hit him. It cut through the stifling air of the ballroom like a sharpened blade, wild jasmine, damp earth, and the electric ozone of a gathering storm. It was an intoxicating, ancient perfume that seized the king by the throat and demanded his absolute surrender. Valerius's steel gaze snapped toward the entrance. There, standing amidst a cluster of minor barons in outdated, threadbare finery, was Isolde Mercer. She was not adorned in silks or jewels. Daughter of Lord Ewan Mercer from the impoverished borderlands of Oakhaven, Isolde wore a simple gown of deep forest green velvet, her dark auburn hair cascading in loose, natural waves over her shoulders. She was breathtakingly ethereal, her pale skin glowing in the candlelight, but it was her eyes wide, deep amber pools of shock and sudden, desperate recognition that locked onto the king. The bond snapped into place between them with the force of a physical blow. Valerius felt the air leave his lungs. Mate, his wolf roared, a primal sound of absolute possession that echoed only in his mind. Mine. The grand hall fell into a hushed, suffocating silence. Every werewolf in the room could feel the sudden, suffocating pressure of their alpha's aura flaring out of control. Valerius descended the obsidian steps, his boots echoing like war drums. The crowd parted instantly, backing away from the terrifying intensity radiating from their king. He stopped mere inches from Isolde. She trembled, gazing up at him, her lips parted in awe and terror. The scent of her was a drug, overriding his logic, urging him to pull her into his arms, to bare his throat to her, to claim her before his kingdom. "My king," Isolde breathed, the words barely a whisper, yet they rang in Valerius's ears like a sacred bell. Valerius raised a trembling hand, his knuckles brushing the soft curve of her cheek. A spark of pure, agonizing electricity jolted through them both. Isolde leaned into his touch, tears of sudden, overwhelming relief welling in her amber eyes. The moon goddess had blessed her. A girl from the forgotten, snow-swept woods of Oakhaven was the fated queen. Then Valerius looked past her shoulder. He saw the cold, furious glare of the Duke of Montague. He saw Lady Vivienne, her beautiful face twisted in aristocratic disdain, her hand resting pointedly on the hilt of a ceremonial dagger, bearing her house's crest. It was a silent, lethal reminder. Choose the girl, and my army marches away. Choose the girl, and your kingdom burns. The wolf inside Valerius thrashed, howling in agony, but the king slammed the iron gates of his duty shut over his soul. He withdrew his hand from Isolde's cheek as if her skin had burned him. The warmth in Isolde's eyes shattered, replaced by a sudden, chilling confusion. I, King Valerius of House Whitmore. His voice boomed, cold and devoid of emotion, carrying to the furthest corners of the vaulted hall, do hereby reject you, Isolde of House Mercer, as my fated mate. A collective gasp tore through the nobility. The severance was a rare, brutal thing, often resulting in madness or death. To do it publicly, to a mate who stood willingly before him, was an act of profound cruelty. Isolde physically collapsed inward, clutching her chest as a choked, broken sob escaped her lips. The invisible, golden thread that had just tethered her soul to his was violently severed. Blood rushed from her face, leaving her ashen and trembling. "Valerius, please," she whispered, the agony in her voice tearing at his very sanity. "Remove her from the citadel," Valerius commanded, turning his back on her, his nails digging so deeply into his palms that his own blood began to drip onto the polished marble floor. "She is banished from the inner court. I have already chosen my queen." He walked straight toward Lady Vivian, who smiled a slow, triumphant smile. Behind him, he heard the frantic shouts of Lord Ewan catching his daughter as she collapsed, her heart breaking in front of the entire kingdom. The scent of wild jasmine spiked with the sharp, bitter tang of immense sorrow, a scent that Valerius would soon learn he could never, ever escape. 3 moons passed since the winter solstice ball. The Silverhorn Kingdom rejoiced in the grand union of King Valerius and Queen Vivian. The royal coffers were replenished, the borders were fortified by Montague steel, and on paper, Valerius was the most successful monarch to sit upon the throne in a century. In reality, the king was dying from the inside out. The consequences of rejecting a true mate were legendary, whispered about in the old texts kept by the kingdom's seers, but Valerius had believed his sheer willpower could conquer the ancient magic. He was wrong. It began with the insomnia. Valerius found himself unable to close his eyes without seeing the devastating betrayal in Isolde's amber gaze. But the true torture was the scent. It was midnight, and a harsh sleet battered the stained-glass windows of the royal bedchamber. Valerius stood shirtless on the freezing stone balcony, the icy wind biting into his scarred flesh. He inhaled deeply, his chest heaving. There it was, jasmine, rain. It was impossible. Oakhaven was a fortnight's ride away, deep in the frozen northern valleys. Yet, her scent clung to the stones of the citadel, wove itself into the heavy velvet drapes, and tainted the very food he ate. "Valerius?" Vivian's voice, sharp and laced with growing irritation, came from the massive 4-poster bed. "Come inside. You are acting like a feral beast." Valerius didn't look at her. To look at his queen was to be reminded of his own treason against his soul. He had not touched Vivian since their wedding night, an obligation he had performed with such cold, mechanical detachment that Vivian had slapped him afterward in furious humiliation. "Leave me be, Vivienne," he growled, the vibration of his voice distorted, leaning too heavily into the cadence of his wolf. Vivian threw off the furs, marching onto the balcony. She was a stunning woman, all sharp angles, platinum hair, and icy blue eyes. But to Valerius's heightened senses, she smelled of copper, ambition, and dust. She lacked the song his soul craved. "I am your queen," she hissed, grabbing his arm. "The court whispers, Valerius, they notice your absence. They notice my empty womb. You humiliate me by pacing the parapets like a grieving widow." Valerius turned slowly, his steel eyes flashing with a dangerous, untamed yellow light. The wolf was dangerously close to the surface, practically clawing at his throat to rip out the throat of the woman who was not his mate. "Do not touch me," Valerius warned, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that forced Vivian to instinctively take a step back, exposing her neck in submission before she could stop herself. He stormed past her, grabbing a heavy cloak and abandoning the royal chambers. He spent the rest of the night in the deep, subterranean dungeons of the citadel, sitting in the absolute dark, surrounded by the scent of damp earth, desperately trying to trick his mind into believing Isolde was near. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in the deteriorating timber fortress of Oakhaven, Isolde Mercer was fading into snow and shadows. The severance had not just broken her heart, it was actively destroying her physical body. The mate's blight, the old women of the village called it. When a wolf's soul is violently untethered, the body begins to reject its own life force. Isolde lay by the dying embers of a stone hearth, wrapped in thick wool blankets that offered no warmth to the bone-deep chill ravaging her. She was devastatingly pale, the once vibrant auburn of her hair losing its luster. Lord Ewan, a proud aging warrior with silver streaking his beard, sat beside her, grinding bitter herbs in a stone bowl. Tears he refused to let fall shone in his weary eyes. Drink this, little bird, Ewan coaxed, his voice cracking, as he lifted a wooden cup to Isolde's cracked lips. It will ease the fever. Isolde managed a weak sip before coughing, her slender frame shaking violently. It hurts, father, she whispered, a solitary tear sliding down her cheek. My chest. It feels like it's caving in. I know, my brave girl, I know, Ewan gripped her cold hand. You must fight it. The king is a fool, a coward who chose gold over the goddess's blessing. Do not let him take your life from afar. But Isolde knew the truth. Every night, in her fever dreams, she felt Valerius's despair. The bond was broken, yes, but the frayed, bleeding ends of it still sparked with a phantom connection. She felt his coldness, his terrifying isolation. She was dying of a broken heart, and somewhere in the stone towers of Highreach, the Alpha King was suffocating on her memory. He is suffering, father, Isolde murmured, her amber eyes staring blankly at the dancing flames. His wolf, it is weeping. Ewan's expression hardened into a mask of pure hatred. Let him weep. Let him rot on his throne of coins. My only concern is you. He set the bowl down and stood, pulling his heavy fur mantle over his broad shoulders. I ride for the Eastern Covens at dawn. There must be a witch, a healer, someone who can purge this bond from your blood before the winter solstice takes you. Isolde closed her eyes, the scent of the bitter herbs fading, replaced by the phantom scent of rain-slicked stone and pine. Valerius. Even in death, she belonged to him. The Silverhorn Kingdom began to wither in tandem with its king. The connection between an alpha and his territory was deeply magical. As Valerius's spirit decayed, the land suffered. An unseasonable, brutal frost settled over the southern farmlands, killing the late autumn crops. Livestock grew feral and attacked their shepherds. The very air in the citadel felt oppressive, thick with a lingering, unspoken dread. Queen Vivienne sat in her private solar, violently stabbing a needle through a piece of fine embroidery. She was intelligent enough to know what was happening. Her husband was not just ignoring her, he was dying of a severed bond. A shadow detached itself from the heavy tapestry near the door. Lord Percival, the kingdom's master of whispers, stepped into the light. He was a lean, rat-faced man who served whoever held the heaviest coin purse. Currently, that was House Montague. You sent for me, my queen? Percival murmured, bowing low. The king is losing his mind, Percival, Vivienne said coldly, not looking up from her violent needlework. Yesterday, he tore the heavy oak doors of the council chamber off their iron hinges because a servant used jasmine oil to polish the wood. The lords are terrified. The whispers of his madness are reaching the northern rogues. We look weak. The bond of the fated mate is a powerful affliction, your grace, Percival replied smoothly. Even broken, the phantom limb remains. Vivienne snapped the needle in half, a drop of blood welling on her pale thumb. I do not care for your poetic nonsense, Percival. I care about my crown. If Valerius goes entirely feral, the council will depose him, and as an unmated, unpregnant queen, I will be sent back to my father in disgrace. She stood, walking to the crackling fireplace, the flames reflecting in her icy eyes. The girl in Oakhaven, Isolde Mercer. She is the anchor to his madness. Percival hesitated. Reports from the border suggest the girl is already dying of the blight, my queen. The severance is doing the work for you. I do not leave my fate to the slow work of fevers and heartaches, Vivienne hissed, spinning to face him. As long as she draws breath, her scent lingers in my husband's mind. I want the anchor destroyed. Completely. Percival bowed his head. Oakhaven is heavily fortified by Lord Ewan's loyalists, despite their poverty. It would require a direct assault. Then orchestrate one, Vivienne commanded, pulling a heavy sack of gold from a locked mahogany chest and tossing it at Percival's feet. The heavy clinking of coins echoed in the quiet room. Hire a band of mercenaries. Disguise them as northern rogues. Have them burn Oakhaven to the ash it deserves to be. Leave no survivors. I want the Mercer line erased from history. Percival smiled thinly, picking up the gold. Consider it done, your grace. By the end of the week, the king's phantom limb will be permanently amputated. 2 nights later, Captain Gideon stood in the freezing rain in the courtyard of Highreach, inspecting a shipment of weapons. Gideon was a massive brute of a man, fiercely loyal to Valerius, but deeply troubled by his friend's decline. As he checked the manifest, a cloaked figure stumbled into the courtyard, collapsing in the mud. It was one of the king's border scouts, exhausted and bleeding from a nasty gash on his forehead. Gideon rushed forward, hauling the man up. What is the meaning of this? Why have you abandoned your post? Captain, the scout gasped, coughing up rainwater. Mercenaries, a massive host, bearing no banners, moving through the whispering woods. They bypassed the western garrisons entirely. Gideon frowned. Moving where? North, Captain. They are marching directly for the valley of Oakhaven. Gideon's blood ran cold. The northern rogues never moved in such organized formations, and they certainly didn't target impoverished baronies with no tactical value. Unless the target wasn't a place, but a person. Gideon didn't bother sending a messenger. He left the scout with the guards and sprinted through the pouring rain, bursting through the heavy doors of the citadel and taking the stairs to the king's chambers 3 at a time. He found Valerius in the armory, sitting on the cold stone floor, mindlessly running a whetstone over his broadsword. The king looked terrible. His cheekbones were hollow, his eyes sunken, and surrounded by dark bruises of exhaustion. His aura was erratic, fluctuating between crippling depression and lethal volatile rage. "My king," Gideon panted, ignoring protocol as he stepped into the room. Valerius didn't look up. Schwing, schwing. The whetstone scraped against the steel. "I told the guards I was not to be disturbed, Gideon, even by you." "Oakhaven is under attack, sire," Gideon said, his voice ringing through the armory. The whetstone stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and terrifying. Valerius slowly lifted his head. The dull, lifeless gray of his eyes had vanished. In its place was the blazing, molten yellow of an alpha wolf, fully unleashed. The air in the room instantly grew so heavy that Gideon felt his knees buckle, his own inner wolf submitting to the overwhelming, suffocating dominance radiating from the king. "Repeat that," Valerius whispered, the sound entirely inhuman, rumbling from deep within his chest. A mercenary host, Gideon managed to choke out, fighting to keep his footing. "Marching on Oakhaven, they intend to wipe it out." The sword clattered to the stone floor. Valerius stood up, and for the first time in months, the king looked truly alive. The madness of the phantom scent, the crippling depression of the broken bond, it all evaporated, burned away by a blinding, terrifying surge of protective instinct. His mate was in danger. The bond, though severed by words, screamed in his blood. Isolde was his. Whether he had rejected her or not, his wolf recognized only one truth. Someone was hunting his female, and they were going to die for it. Valerius bypassed Gideon, his strides long and predatory. "Saddle my horse," the Alpha King commanded, his voice echoing through the corridors like a thunderclap, waking the entire citadel. "And rouse the royal guard. Anyone who cannot ride in 5 minutes stays behind." "Sire," the Queen Gideon started, trailing after him. Valerius paused at the top of the stairs, turning back to his captain. His fangs had descended, resting sharply against his bottom lip. "If I find out Vivian had a hand in this," Valerius snarled softly, "the promise of violence absolute, I will not need an executioner. I will tear her apart myself." Without another word, the Alpha King descended into the storm, riding north into the night to reclaim the very thing he had thrown away. Thunder shook the heavens as the Alpha King and his royal guard tore through the treacherous mountain passes. Mud and sleet flew from the hooves of their massive war horses. Valerius rode at the vanguard, unbothered by the freezing rain violently lashing against his face. His mind was entirely consumed by a singular, deafening roar of panic. Through the faint, bleeding remnants of their severed bond, Valerius felt a sudden, agonizing spike of terror that did not belong to him. She was awake. She was frightened. The attack on Oakhaven had begun. "Push them!" Valerius bellowed over the howling wind, his eyes glowing a solid, terrifying gold in the darkness. "Ride until the beasts collapse, and then run on your own 2 feet." Captain Gideon, riding hard at his king's flank, nodded grimly. The guardsmen did not question the suicidal pace. They could feel the oppressive, feral waves of their alpha's distress crashing over them, commanding absolute obedience. Miles ahead, the valley of Oakhaven was burning. Flames licked the dark winter sky, consuming the ancient timber palisades that had protected House Mercer for generations. The air was thick with the suffocating stench of smoke, burning thatch, and the metallic tang of spilled blood. The mercenary host, clad in blackened leather and chainmail, had breached the main gates with battering rams, pouring into the impoverished courtyard like a swarm of locusts. Lord Ewan Mercer fought like a demon of old. Though his gray hair was matted with blood from a shallow cut on his brow, the aging warrior swung his heavy broadsword with devastating precision, cleaving through 2 mercenaries who dared to rush him. But he was surrounded. His loyal retainers were falling one by one, hopelessly outnumbered by the sheer mass of the invading force. Inside the crumbling stone keep, Isolde Mercer dragged herself from her sickbed. The mate's blight had stripped her of her strength, leaving her dangerously thin and fragile. Every breath rattled in her lungs, yet the sound of her people dying outside ignited a desperate final spark of defiance within her. She gripped an iron fireplace poker with trembling, pale hands, using the stone wall to keep herself upright. Her amber eyes, though sunken, burned with a fierce light. If she was destined to die this night, she would not perish shivering under a wool blanket while her father bled in the snow. The heavy oak door to her bedchamber suddenly splintered. A massive mercenary kicked it inward, his face scarred and twisted into a cruel grin. He stepped over the threshold, his eyes raking over Isolde's frail form in her white sleeping gown. "Well now," the mercenary sneered, stepping closer. "Lord Percival said to burn the village, but he didn't say, we couldn't have a little fun with the local lord's daughter before we snap her neck." Isolde raised the iron poker, her knuckles white. "Take one more step," she rasped, her voice trembling but unbroken, "and I will drive this through your throat." The man laughed, drawing a jagged hunting knife. He lunged. Before Isolde could swing, a sound utterly unnatural shattered the night. It was not a battle cry. It was a roar so deeply primal, so completely laced with lethal, unhinged power, that the timber floorboards beneath their feet visibly vibrated. The mercenary froze in his tracks. The blood draining from his face as pure, instinctual terror seized his nervous system. Outside, the courtyard had descended into a sudden, horrifying silence. Isolde dragged herself to the fractured window, looking down into the blazing inferno below. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. King Valerius had not brought an army. He had brought an execution. The Alpha King dropped from his exhausted horse, just as it cleared the shattered gates. He did not draw his sword. Instead, his body convulsed, his bones cracking and reshaping in midair. By the time his boots hit the blood-soaked snow, Valerius was no longer a man. He was a monstrous, towering wolf of pitch-black fur, standing well over 7 feet at the shoulder, his eyes burning like twin suns. The mercenaries, hardened killers who feared no man, broke ranks and screamed. Valerius moved faster than the human eye could track. He became a blur of shadows and fangs, a force of nature entirely consumed by a catastrophic rage. He tore through the heavily armored mercenaries as if they were made of wet parchment. He ripped throats from necks, shattered spines with a single swipe of his massive paws, and painted the snowy courtyard red. Captain Gideon and the royal guard arrived moments later, but there was little left for them to do. The king was butchering the invading force with a brutality that bordered on madness. It was not just a defense, it was a punishment. The mercenary in Isolde's room turned, panic seizing his features as he realized the slaughter occurring below. He bolted for the door, abandoning his prize, but he did not make it 3 steps. A massive shadow blocked the doorway. Valerius stood there, having shifted back to his human form. He was completely drenched in blood, his chest heaving, his muscles coiled with lethal tension. His steel-gray eyes, still bleeding with golden alpha light, locked onto the mercenary. The man dropped his knife, raising his hands in terrified surrender. "Mercy, your grace, we were paid. It was just coin." Valerius did not speak. He stepped forward, grabbed the man by the armored collar, and effortlessly hurled him through the shattered remnants of the window. A sickening crunch echoed from the courtyard below, followed by absolute silence. Valerius turned slowly. Across the room, bathed in the flickering orange light of the burning village, stood Isolde. The heavy, intoxicating scent of wild jasmine and rain washed over the king, burying the stench of blood. It hit him with the force of a battering ram. He fell to his knees on the wooden floor, the monstrous, feral energy instantly vanishing from his frame, replaced by a devastating, crippling wave of absolute relief. She was alive. "Isolde," he whispered, his voice cracking, a single tear cutting through the blood on his cheek. Isolde stared at the man who had shattered her soul. The iron poker slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against the stone. The adrenaline faded, and the mate's blight violently reasserted its grip. Her knees buckled. Valerius moved with supernatural speed, catching her frail body before she hit the ground. He pulled her against his broad chest, burying his face in her auburn hair, inhaling the scent that had haunted him for months. "Don't touch me," Isolde gasped weakly, her hands feebly pushing against his blood-soaked chest. "You severed it. You threw me away." "I was a fool," Valerius sobbed, the powerful Alpha King openly weeping into the curve of her neck, his body shaking with the force of his grief. I was a blind, arrogant fool. I am so sorry, my love. I am so sorry. Below them in the courtyard, Captain Gideon turned over the body of the mercenary captain. Beneath the man's leather armor, a heavy velvet coin purse spilled open onto the snow. The gold coins bore the heavy, unmistakable crest of House Montague. Gideon looked up at the window of the keep, his jaw setting into a hard, unforgiving line. The queen had signed her own death warrant. The fire in the hearth had been stoked to a roaring blaze, but Isolde's skin remained as cold as the mountain snow. Valerius sat on the edge of her bed, refusing to let her go. He held her against his chest, wrapping his heavy fur cloak around them both, trying to force his own blistering body heat into her failing veins. Lord Ewan stood near the door, his hand resting tightly on the hilt of his sword. He watched the king with a mixture of deep loathing and desperate hope. He hated Valerius for what he had done to his daughter, but right now, the Alpha's presence was the only thing keeping Isolde tethered to the mortal realm. "She is fading, King Valerius," Ewan said, his voice hard, though tears shone in his weary eyes. "Your arrival slowed the blight, but the severance is a poison. It is stopping her heart." Valerius tightened his grip on Isolde. Her breathing was shallow, incredibly uneven. Her amber eyes fluttered, struggling to stay focused on his face. "Valerius," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I am here, little bird. I am right here," Valerius murmured frantically, brushing damp strands of auburn hair from her pale forehead. "Why did you come?" she asked, a tear slipping free to trace a clean line down her cheek. "You chose your crown. You chose her." The words felt like daggers plunging repeatedly into his chest. Valerius rested his forehead against hers. "I chose nothing," he choked out, his voice thick with raw agony. "I tried to be a king for my people, but I destroyed my own soul in the process. I have not slept. I have not breathed a full breath since the moment I walked away from you. The crown is ash in my mouth. Without you, I am nothing but a feral beast." Isolde closed her eyes, a weak, tragic smile touching her lips. "It is too late. The thread is cut." "No," Valerius growled, a surge of desperate alpha magic flaring to life within him. The air in the room grew heavy, crackling with static electricity. "I refuse. I am the Alpha King, and I do not accept this fate. You are mine, Isolde Mercer, and I am yours." He didn't hesitate. Valerius tilted her head back slightly, baring her elegant, fragile throat. With a low, rumbling growl that vibrated deep in his chest, he let his fangs descend. He pressed his lips to the junction of her shoulder and neck, finding the pulse point that beat with a sluggish, dying rhythm. "Valerius, what are you doing?" Lord Ewan stepped forward, alarm flashing in his eyes. "Reforging the bond," Valerius stated, his eyes glowing with an intense, unwavering golden light. "With blood and soul." He sank his fangs into her flesh. Isolde gasped, her eyes flying wide open. It was not a bite of aggression, but a sacred, ancient claim. As Valerius's venom mixed with her blood, a shockwave of pure, blinding energy erupted from them. The unseen golden tether that had been violently severed months ago suddenly snapped back into existence, thicker and more radiant than before. Valerius poured his own life force into the bite, forcing the strength of his alpha blood to combat the decay of the blight. He felt her pain, her sorrow, and her lingering anger wash over him, and he accepted it all willingly. He mentally laid his inner wolf bare, showing her his absolute devotion, his crushing guilt, and his unyielding love. Isolde arched off the bed, a sharp intake of breath filling her lungs. The terrible, suffocating weight that had crushed her chest for months suddenly vanished. The cold that had seeped into her bones was replaced by a rushing, liquid fire. Valerius withdrew, licking the puncture wound to seal it, his eyes frantically searching her face. Color began to flood back into Isolde's cheeks. The deathly pallor faded, replaced by the vibrant flush of life. Her amber eyes, previously clouded with impending death, sharpened. They locked onto Valerius's steel-gray gaze, and for the first time, she saw the absolute truth in him. There was no king sitting before her. There was only her mate, a man who had ripped his own world apart to find her again. Isolde reached up, her hand no longer trembling, and cupped his jaw. "My king," she whispered, the title no longer a formal address, but a term of deep, intimate endearment. Valerius let out a shuddering breath, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that tasted of tears, blood, and salvation. It was a desperate, consuming embrace, sealing the bond permanently. The scent of wild jasmine and rain bloomed beautifully in the room, chasing away the shadows of death. 3 days later, the gates of the citadel at Highreach were blown open by the sheer force of a battering ram. But this time, it was not an invading army. It was the king returning home. Valerius rode into the central courtyard on his massive warhorse, but he did not ride alone. Seated securely in front of him, wrapped tightly in his own royal fur mantle, was Isolde. She sat tall, her strength restored, her presence radiating a calm, grounding magic that instantly settled the erratic, anxious energy that had plagued the castle for months. Queen Vivienne stood at the top of the obsidian grand staircase, flanked by Lord Percival and a dozen of her Montague guards. She wore her most resplendent gown, a desperate attempt to project authority, but her face was pale, with a terror she could not hide. The news of the mercenary slaughter had reached her hours ago. Valerius dismounted, lifting Isolde down beside him. He did not draw his sword. He didn't need to. The lethal calmness radiating from him was far more terrifying than his previous rage. He ascended the stairs, Isolde's hand held firmly in his. The nobility, gathered in the courtyard, parted in absolute silence, watching as the true fated queen walked among them. Valerius, Vivienne attempted to smile, her voice shrill and shaking. You have returned, and you have brought a prisoner? Valerius stopped 2 steps below Vivienne. He reached into his cloak and withdrew the heavy velvet coin purse bearing the Montague crest, tossing it at her feet. It landed with a heavy, condemning thud. Treason, Vivienne, Valerius said, his voice carrying clearly over the dead silence of the courtyard. Attempted murder of your Alpha's fated mate, funding an unsanctioned mercenary strike upon a protected realm. Vivienne backed away, her eyes darting frantically to her guards. Lies. That coin could belong to anyone. Lord Percival, tell him. She turned to her master of whispers, but Percival was already on his knees in the dirt, surrounded by Captain Gideon and 3 royal guards, a sword pressed firmly to his neck. Percival had sung like a bird the moment he realized the king had survived the north. Valerius stepped up onto the landing. Your army will leave my borders by nightfall. You are stripped of your title, your lands, and your protections. You are banished from the Silverhorn Kingdom forever. If I ever see your face again, Vivienne, I will not banish you. I will bury you. Vivienne crumpled, sobbing as Gideon's guards stepped forward to forcefully escort her to the dungeons to await her carriage. The false queen had fallen. Valerius turned, looking down at the massive crowd of nobility. He looked at Isolde, pulling her up to stand beside him. The golden thread between them pulsed with warmth and rightness. I made a grave error in judgment to protect this kingdom, Valerius announced, his voice echoing with absolute authority. I defied the goddess, and we all paid the price, but the winter is over. He reached up, unfastening the heavy silver clasp of his own cloak, and draped it over Isolde's shoulders, a deeply symbolic gesture of shared rule. Behold Isolde of House Mercer, the Alpha King declared, dropping to one knee before her, an act of submission that shocked the entire court into absolute awe. My true mate, my anchor, and your one, rightful, queen. The courtyard erupted into cheers, the sound deafening and joyful. The suffocating dread that had plagued the kingdom vanished, replaced by the scent of jasmine, rain, and a desperately needed dawn. The Alpha King had finally chosen correctly, and his phantom haunting was over. The Alpha King chose another mate, but her scent haunted him every night, is a dramatic tale that proves true love cannot be outrun, ignored, or traded for political gain. King Valerius learned the hard way that defying the sacred bond of a fated mate only leads to madness, physical decay, and the near destruction of his kingdom. It took a tragic separation, a devastating illness, and a brutal battle in the snow to force the king to realize that Isolde was not just a peasant girl, but the very anchor of his soul. In the end, power and wealth pale in comparison to the electric, undeniable pull of destiny. If this dramatic werewolf romance kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share this story with your fellow fantasy lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more epic tales of Alpha Kings, fated mates, and unyielding love.
Hi, my name is Mountain Confessions, the owner and manager of Mountain Confessions. After watching the video, the Alpha King chose another mate, but her scent haunted him every night. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the feeling of regret running beneath the entire story. Sometimes people make choices based on pressure, pride, or what seems right in the moment, only to realize later that their heart never truly moved on. I think that emotional conflict is what made this story so powerful. The idea that someone's presence could linger in his thoughts every night says a lot about how difficult it can be to ignore real emotional connection once it's felt. Do you think the Alpha King truly loved the mate he chose, or was he trying to convince himself he made the right decision? And why do you think stories about regret and missed chances connect so deeply with people emotionally? I think stories like this remind us to pay attention to genuine feelings before fear, expectation, or pride push us toward choices we may later regret. If this story stayed with you emotionally, I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional Alpha King stories filled with tension, regret, and powerful connections, feel free to like and subscribe only if you'd like to see more.